7 days after my son's wedding, I opened the door to find my daughter-in-law standing there with a lawyer and a moving crew. They handed me a stack of documents forged, ones claiming I had signed over my house. Then they gave me 72 hours to leave. If you think this is the climax of the story, you haven't heard anything yet. Hit the follow button right now so you don't miss out on stories that will leave you in disbelief. Like this video and comment with the city or country you're watching from. I want to know just how far my stories have traveled. I have spent 69 years trying to be a reasonable woman. Paid my taxes on time. I kept my promises. I showed up to things I didn't want to attend, because showing up is what decent people do. I raised my son the same way, teaching him that the small, unglamorous acts of loyalty were the ones that actually mattered. I thought I did a decent job. I thought for a long time that I had. I was wrong about a lot of things that week. It was a Tuesday morning in late October, the kind of morning where the light comes in flat and gray through the kitchen windows, and the coffee doesn't taste quite right, no matter how many times you adjust the ratio. 7 days since Ethan's wedding. 7 days since I had sat in the second row of a small event hall and watched my son marry a woman I had met exactly 4 times before she became his wife. I wasn't going to say anything about that. I had made a decision quiet, deliberate, that Ethan was 34 years old and his choices were his own. Celeste Voss was polished and confident and spoke in the smooth, unbroken cadences of someone who had learned very early that charm was a form of currency. I noticed things about her that made me uneasy. The way her eyes moved when money came up in conversation. The way she asked questions that weren't really questions, they were assessments. She made Ethan happy, or she made him appear happy, and I had decided that was enough. 7 days later, she was standing at my front door. I heard the truck first, a low diesel rumble pulling up outside, idling. I thought it was a delivery. I had ordered a small space heater for the bedroom. The old one had finally given out, and I was already moving toward the door with my coffee mug in hand, still in my robe, entirely unprepared for what I was about to see. 3 men in gray uniforms were climbing out of a moving truck. Not a small truck, a large one. The kind you rent when you are relocating an entire household. And standing on my front walk, in a camel-colored coat I recognized from the wedding reception, was Celeste. Beside her stood a man in a dark suit, mid-50s, carrying a leather portfolio. He had the particular stillness of someone who does uncomfortable things for a living, and has made a professional peace with it. I opened the door, Celeste. I kept my voice level. I am good at that. My late husband, Gerald, used to say I could remain calm in a burning building, and he didn't always mean it as a compliment. What is this? She smiled. That same smile from the wedding wide, practiced, landing just slightly to the left of genuine warmth. Margaret. She said my name the way you'd greet a stranger, whose name you'd been given in advance. This is Daniel Frew. He's handling the paperwork. The man in the suit stepped forward and held out a manila envelope. I took it without thinking. You take things people hand you. It's a reflex, and he said, Mrs. Holloway, we're here to begin the transition process. As you'll see from the documents, the property transfer was completed and filed last Thursday. You have 72 hours to remove your personal belongings before the new owners take possession. I looked at him. I looked down at the envelope in my hand. Then I looked at the moving truck, where one of the gray uniformed men was pulling out a dolly. I'm sorry, I said. I think there's been some kind of mistake. There hasn't, Celeste said. Her voice had changed. The warm edges were gone. What was underneath was something harder, flatter, and far more honest than anything I'd heard from her before. You signed the transfer documents 3 weeks ago, Margaret. The filing is complete. This house belongs to Ethan and me now. We're giving you 72 hours as a courtesy. I want to tell you that I exploded, that I said every sharp and righteous thing that was sitting at the back of my throat. But that is not what happened. What happened is that my hands went very still, and something inside me got very quiet, and I opened the envelope. There were several documents inside, legal looking, dense with language, property transfer agreement, notarization stamps, and at the bottom, what appeared to be my signature. Margaret Eleanor Holloway. I stared at that signature for a long moment. I hadn't used Eleanor since 1987. Gerald and I had a complicated year that year, nothing I'll go into, and somewhere in the middle of it, I had quietly dropped the middle name from everything. My driver's license, my accounts, my correspondence. Everyone who knew me well enough to matter knew I was Margaret R. Holloway now, the R standing for Rose. My mother's name, added informally years ago, though never legally changed. Margaret Eleanor. I looked at that signature for exactly 4 seconds. Then I folded the documents back into the envelope, set it on the entry table, and said, "I'll need some time to review these." Celeste's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "You have 72 hours. Then I'll use them wisely," I said, and I closed the door. I stood in my hallway for a moment that felt longer than it was. The coffee in my mug had gone cold. Outside, I could hear the men from the moving truck talking to each other in low voices, the clatter of equipment. I could hear Celeste saying something to the lawyer, her voice clipped and certain. I did not feel certain about anything, except one thing. That signature was not mine. Eleanor gave it away. But even beyond that, even if the name had been right, the slant of the letters was wrong. I have a slight leftward pull to my handwriting, a habit I developed in childhood that my third-grade teacher called backwards leaning and that I never corrected. The signature on those documents went straight up and then right. Clean, practiced, and completely unlike anything my hand had ever produced. Someone had studied my signature. They just hadn't studied it carefully enough. I set my coffee mug on the kitchen counter and stood there a moment with my eyes closed, doing the particular kind of thinking that doesn't look like thinking from the outside. Gerald used to watch me do it and say I looked like I was napping standing up. He wasn't entirely wrong. Then I went upstairs. The third drawer of my old oak dresser, the one I had dragged through 3 houses and never once replaced because Gerald bought it for me when we were first married, and I am stubborn about certain things, is filled with what appears to be old. Scarves and a broken wristwatch and a stack of Christmas cards from people I've lost touch with. Under those, wrapped in a faded green sweater, is a phone. Not a smartphone, a small older model, the kind that flips open. Prepaid. The battery dies if you leave it too long, so I replace it every 6 months and note the date on a piece of tape on the back. Gerald gave it to me 10 years before he died. He had grown up with a different kind of worry than most people his family had been. Through things I won't detail here, and he had a deep-seated belief that a person should always have a private line. Something nobody knew about. Something that existed outside the regular architecture of your life. "You'll probably never need it," he had said. "But if you do, you'll be very glad it's there." He was right. Gerald was right about most things, which was both his best quality and occasionally his most infuriating one. I unwrapped the phone, powered it on. The battery was at 43%. I had charged it 2 months ago in August. I scrolled to the only contact saved in it, Renee Calder. Let me explain Renee. 40 years ago, I was not a widow living quietly in a modest house with a vegetable garden and a reputation for making very good pie at neighborhood events. I was a research engineer, 30 years old, working 70-hour weeks at a medical technology firm called Orion Diagnostics. The work was painstaking and often frustrating and occasionally thrilling in the way that only very specific technical problems can be thrilling when the solution finally appears, and it is both elegant and obvious, and you cannot believe it took so long. I was part of a small team that developed a new approach to low-radiation imaging. I won't bore you with the technical details. What matters is that the approach worked, and it worked better than anyone had expected. And the patents that came out of that work eventually made a great deal of money. I had been careful. Over the years, very carefully and very quietly, I had allowed a portion of that money to accumulate in a private trust structure. Gerald helped set it up. Renee Calder, a trust attorney with an office in a building that looked deliberately unimportant, had managed it since Gerald's death. I lived modestly by choice. I drove a 9-year-old car. I kept the same house. I bought groceries on sale, and I fixed things when they broke rather than replacing them. Ethan thought his mother was comfortable but not wealthy. He thought her retirement savings were modest. Her house, the most significant asset she had. He had told me, years ago, about some business difficulty he'd had lost money on something. I never got the full story, and I had written him a check for $11,000 from my regular account. The amount I could give, without triggering questions I wasn't ready to answer. I did not tell him about the trust because I wanted him to build his own life. I wanted the choices he made to be real choices, made by someone who understood that nobody was going to rescue him. That was not cruelty. That was the belief that a person grows in proportion to what they carry themselves. I had been rethinking that decision for the past 48 hours, ever since a call from an old friend in the financial community had told me, in vague but unmistakable terms, that Ethan and his new wife had significant debt problems, kind that made people desperate. Now, standing in my bedroom with a flip phone in my hand, I understood exactly how desperate they had become. I called Renee. She picked up on the second ring, Margaret. Renee, I kept my voice low even though I was alone. I need you to open the Blackwood Trust. A pause. She had been waiting for this call, in one form or another, for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was composed and careful, the way it always was. What happened? My son's wife came to my door this morning, with a lawyer and a moving crew, I said. She had forged transfer documents for this property. Apparently, I signed them 3 weeks ago, which would be impressive given that I've never met this lawyer before in my life. Another pause. Shorter. Are you safe right now? I'm fine. They left. They gave me 72 hours to vacate. Margaret. The signature has my old middle name on it, I said. I haven't used that name since Reagan's second term. Then Renee said, very quietly, oh, they have no idea. No, I agreed. They really don't. After I hung up, I sat on the edge of my bed for a while. Outside, the moving truck was still idling. I could hear it. They were waiting for some sign of compliance, I suppose, some sound of drawers opening, of boxes being pulled from closets, the sound of a frightened old woman beginning to dismantle her life on their schedule. Instead, I sat on the bed where I had slept for 31 years, in the house I had bought with my husband, in the room where I had read and thought and grieved and recovered and read some more, and I let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened. My son knew about this, he had to. Ethan might not have known every detail. He might not have understood the full scope of what Celeste was doing. But he had let her come to my door with a moving crew. He had let someone put a forged signature on a document and file it with a court. Whatever the degree of his involvement, he had not stopped it. That knowledge was its own kind of grief, separate from the anger. I had held Ethan as a baby in a hospital room, while Gerald paced the hallway because he was too nervous to sit still. I had made his lunch for 13 years. I had watched him fall off bicycles and fail tests and break up with his first girlfriend and cry in the kitchen over it when he thought I wasn't home. I had known him when he was small enough to fit under my arm. And now he had sent his wife to put me out of my own house. I sat with that for a moment. I didn't try to explain it away or soften its edges. Some things deserve to be felt clearly before you decide what to do with them. Then I stood up. I went downstairs, made a fresh pot of coffee, and opened the forged documents on the kitchen table. I read every page, I noted every error. By the time I reached the last page, I had 6 things written on a yellow legal pad. 6 things wrong with documents that someone had spent real time and money to produce. 6 mistakes made by people who believed they were dealing with a confused, grieving, isolated old woman with no resources and no recourse. I uncapped my pen. I wrote a 7th note at the bottom of the pad. They think the house is the most valuable thing I have. I underlined it twice. Then I added, beneath it they are going to learn otherwise. Outside, the moving truck finally gave up and drove away. I poured my coffee, sat back down at the kitchen table, and began to make a list of every phone call I needed to make before morning. The next 72 hours would not go the way Celeste Voss had planned. But first, I needed to understand exactly how deep this went and what my son had agreed to before he ever sent his wife to my door. The first call I made that night was not to a lawyer. It was to Patricia Owens, who had been my neighbor for 22 years and who knew everything that happened on Crestwood Lane before it actually happened, because Patricia had a gift for paying attention that most people mistake for nosiness. I had never mistaken it. Attention, real attention, is one of the rarest things a person can offer. Pat, I said when she picked up, did you see the truck this morning? Pause. Then Margaret, I was going to call you. I didn't know if I should. I watched that woman for almost 20 minutes from my kitchen window. Who was that man with her? A lawyer, apparently. She was pointing at your house, like she was already measuring it for drapes. Patricia's voice had that particular edge it got when she was genuinely upset, but trying to stay useful. What is going on? I'm still figuring that out, I said. But I need to ask you something. In the last few weeks, have you seen anyone here? At the house, I mean. When I wasn't home, silence, longer than I expected. Pat, there was a woman, she said slowly. About 3 weeks ago. Tuesday, I think. You had your doctor's appointment, you mentioned it at the mailbox the week before. I didn't think much of it. I thought maybe it was a cleaning service or something. What did she look like? 40s, dark hair, professional looking. She had a clipboard, a pause. She was only inside for maybe 10 minutes. I should have said something. I'm sorry, Margaret. I thought you'd hired someone. Don't apologize, I said. You just told me exactly what I needed to know. I thanked her and hung up. 10 minutes inside my house while I was at the doctor's. That was enough time, if you knew where to look, or if you had done your research in advance to photograph personal documents. to study a signature, to look through correspondence and gather enough information to build a convincing forgery. They had been planning this before the wedding. I sat with that thought in the quiet of my kitchen, and I let it reshape everything I thought I understood about the past few months. The wedding had felt rushed. Ethan had announced the engagement in July, and the ceremony was in October. 3 months. I had chalked it up to Celeste being decisive, to Ethan being swept along, to the general modern impatience with long engagements. Now I understood the timeline differently. They needed the wedding first, gave Celeste a legal relationship to Ethan, which gave her a connection to his family's estate. The wedding wasn't the beginning of a life together. It was the beginning of an operation. I poured myself a glass of water and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the backyard where Gerald's rose bushes had gone dormant for winter. He had planted 7 of them the year Ethan was born. I had kept them going for 11 years without him, which was harder than it sounds, because roses are particular, and Gerald had a touch with them that I never quite replicated. I thought about what Renee had said before we ended our call. I'm going to need 48 hours to get everything in order, she had told me. Margaret, the trust is fully intact. Nobody has touched it. Whatever documents they filed, they can't touch the trust through a property transfer. They're separate legal structures entirely. But I want to bring in someone on the litigation side. There's a woman I've worked with before, Diane Cho. She's handled elder financial exploitation cases. She's very good, and she's not going to be impressed by a forged notary stamp. Good, I had said. In the meantime, Renee added, don't sign anything. Don't acknowledge the documents in writing. And Margaret, be careful about how much they know. They've been watching you. They have, I said. I'm fairly certain they have. Then assume they're still watching. Don't do anything that signals you've mobilized. That was good advice. The kind of advice that required a particular kind of discipline, the discipline of appearing defeated while you are anything but. I had never been especially good at performing helplessness, but I was motivated. I went to bed at 11. I slept 4 hours, which was better than I expected. By 6 in the morning, I was back at the kitchen table with fresh coffee and the yellow legal pad, and I had started a second page. What I knew, forged transfer documents, filed with the county. A fake notary stamp. My old middle name used on the signature, a detail that would have gone unnoticed by anyone who didn't know me well, which was the point. Someone accessing my home while I was at the doctor. A lawyer named Daniel Frew, who I had not yet looked up but intended to. What I didn't know how deep Ethan was in this, whether the debt my contact had mentioned was as serious as the scheme suggested, and whether there were other components I hadn't seen yet, other documents, other filings, other pieces of a plan that was larger than a single property transfer. That last question was the one that kept pulling at me. Because here is the thing about people who forge documents and arrive with moving crews, they rarely stop at the first move. That kind of scheme has a logic to it, an architecture. Property transfer was one piece. What were the others? I found out later that morning, and it was worse than I had imagined. Renee called at 9:45. I've been doing some digging, she said, and her voice had a careful quality to it that I recognized. Renee Calder had managed my financial affairs for 11 years, and she was not a person who alarmed easily. When she sounded careful, it meant she was choosing words, because the words mattered. There's a guardianship petition that was filed with the probate court 4 days ago. I set down my coffee. Tell me, it names you as the subject. The basis of the petition is cognitive decline. They submitted a medical evaluation, asserting that you are no longer capable of managing your own finances or personal affairs. The evaluation is dated 6 weeks ago. The doctor listed is a doctor, Carl Misson, who practices about 40 miles from here. I have never seen a Dr. Carl Misson in my life. I know, Renee said. The evaluation is fabricated. His license is real, so they used his name and credentials, and presumably paid someone to produce documentation that looks like it came from his office. We can verify that he never actually examined you. His practice records, if we subpoena them, will not contain your name. I stayed quiet for a moment, processing. A guardianship petition. If that petition succeeded, and these things do succeed, especially when a family member is the one filing and a medical professional is signed off, I would lose the legal right to make my own decisions. My financial decisions, my medical decisions, my living arrangements. Celeste and Ethan would become my legal guardians. They would control everything, my bank accounts, the house they were trying to claim, my medical care, my insurance policies. Renee, I said slowly, What is the life insurance situation, my policy with Meridian? Is it still structured the way Gerald and I set it up? Pause. Yes, Ethan is the primary beneficiary on the face policy. But, Margaret, there's a significant policy rider that was added 7 years ago that I don't think Ethan knows about. He doesn't, I said. Gerald and I added it after the 2013 situation. Right. So the rider restructures the payout through the trust if the death occurs under certain circumstances, or if the primary beneficiary is found to have acted against the policyholder's interests. I said it evenly, the way you recite something you memorized a long time ago. Gerald and I had spent an entire evening with Renee going over that language. We had been careful. We had been, it turned out, prescient. What I need to know is whether they know the rider exists. Based on what they're doing, Renee said. I don't think so. I think they know about the face value of the policy and nothing else. Which means the insurance money is part of the calculation, I said. This isn't just about the house. No, Renee said. I don't think it ever was. I stood up from the kitchen table and walked to the window again. The rose bushes, the gray sky, the ordinary quiet of a Wednesday morning on a street where everyone else was going about their lives normally. My son had, whether he fully understood it or not, signed onto a scheme to take my home, have me declared legally incompetent, and eventually collect on my life insurance. The word for that, the legal word, the accurate word, was elder exploitation. The other accurate word, depending on the final intent, was darker than that. I did not let myself say that word yet. I needed more information before I was willing to go that far. But I did not dismiss it. I called Ethan at 10:15. I want to be honest about this. I had a script in my head. I had decided very deliberately what I was going to say and what I was not going to say. Renee had told me not to reveal what I knew. Diane Cho, the litigation attorney who had called me at 9 to briefly introduce herself, had been even more direct. If they know you're mobilizing, they'll move faster. Right now you have the element of surprise. Don't give it up. So I called my son, and I performed a version of myself that wasn't entirely false. A mother who was frightened, who was confused, who needed to understand what was happening. He picked up after 3 rings. Mom, his voice was strange. Tight like something wound too hard. Ethan, I said. Celeste came to the house yesterday with a lawyer and a moving crew. I need you to explain to me what's going on. A pause that told me everything I needed to know about how prepared he was for this call, which was to say he knew it was coming, but he hadn't fully decided what he was going to say. He was improvising, which meant he was uncomfortable, which meant that somewhere under all of this was the son I actually knew, the one who couldn't look me in the eyes when he'd done something he was ashamed of, the one who had cried in the kitchen over a girl when he was 17. Mom, there's no reason to be upset. We're just trying to simplify things. You're on your own. The house is big. The maintenance. Ethan, I kept my voice gentle. The documents say I transferred the property 3 weeks ago. Did you know about those documents? Another pause. Shorter. It was handled through a legal process, he said. Everything's legitimate. Did you know about those documents? I repeated. Mom, you need to trust that Celeste and I have your best interests. I'm going to ask you one more time, I said, and my voice dropped to the tone I used exactly twice in his childhood. The tone that meant I was not going to repeat myself again. Did you know about those documents? Silence. Then yes. That single word landed in my chest like a stone dropping into still water. I had told myself I was prepared for it. I had told myself, sitting at the kitchen table at 6 in the morning with my legal pad, that I had already accepted the possibility. I had been wrong. You can know a thing intellectually and still feel it physically when it's confirmed. You can think you've braced yourself and still find out there was no real way to brace. Okay, I said. Mom, I understand, Ethan. Thank you for telling me. I hung up. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that, not thinking exactly, just sitting. The clock on the wall ticked. A car went past outside. The refrigerator made the small hum it always made, the one I'd been meaning to have looked at for 6 months. Then I picked up the pen and wrote on the bottom of the legal pad. He knew. Renee came to the house at noon with Diane Cho, and the 3 of us sat at my kitchen table for 4 hours. Diane Cho was 53, small, with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses she took on and off in a way that seemed entirely unconscious. She had a yellow legal pad of her own, and she covered it in notes with a pen she clicked constantly, a habit that would have driven me mad under other circumstances. But that morning felt oddly reassuring, like the sound of someone working, really working, on your behalf. The forgery is actually quite good, Diane said, spreading the documents on my kitchen table and studying them with the glasses on. The notary stamp is the weak point. Whoever produced it used a seal that matches a notary who retired in 2019. It's verifiable through public records. That alone invalidates the filing. She looked up. Did they give you any other documents? Just these. I placed the folder on the table. About access to your accounts. Has anything moved? Renee checked this morning, I said. Nothing has moved. They haven't attempted the accounts yet. Yet, Diane said. Not with drama. Just noting it accurately. Okay. The guardianship petition is actually the bigger concern right now. The property transfer we can get reversed. The forgery evidence is strong enough, and with no supporting evidence of an actual transaction, it falls apart fast. But the guardianship petition, she paused, clicking the pen twice. That requires a hearing, and until the hearing, a temporary order can be issued that restricts your independent action. How long until the hearing? Renee asked. Typically 4 to 6 weeks. Diane paused again, this time looking directly at me. If they can show urgency, if they argue that you're in immediate danger of making harmful financial decisions, the court can issue interim restrictions much faster. Within days. They're going to try to do that, I said. Diane looked at me steadily. What makes you say that? Because Celeste struck me as someone who follows up, I said. She came to the door, assuming it was over. When it wasn't, when I didn't immediately start moving boxes, she's going to recalculate. She's going to understand that I've had time to think. And when she understands that, yes, she's going to push for interim restrictions. Diane nodded slowly. Then she said, okay, then we have to move faster than she does. What followed was not elegant. I want to be clear about that, because there is a version of this story where a woman in my position springs a perfectly constructed trap, and everything unfolds with satisfying precision. That is not what happened. What happened was 4 women, myself, Renee, Diane, and Diane's paralegal, a young woman named Sonia who arrived at 2 with 2 large bags of files, working at a kitchen table until nearly 9 at night, building a case out of whatever we could gather in real time. I gave them access to everything I had, 31 years of property records, my original deed, tax filings, the complete history of my medical care, including the name and direct contact of every physician who had actually treated me, my bank records, my legitimate power of attorney documents that named Renee as trustee and had been on file for 9 years. I gave them the phone records from the flip phone, the contact with Renee, the date and time stamped. Sonia photographed every page of the forged documents and sent them to a forensic document examiner Diane had used before. The examiner, working from his home office, in a city I don't know the name of, called back at 4:30 with a preliminary assessment. The documents showed signs of digital fabrication in the signature. The notary stamp did not match any current records, and the ink distribution in the body of the text suggested inkjet printing rather than a professional legal printer. Would this hold up in court? Diane asked him. Absolutely, he said. I can have a full written assessment to you by Friday morning. Meanwhile, Renee had been on the phone with 2 separate contacts in the county records office and had obtained, through proper channels, the documentation of how and when the fraudulent transfer had been filed. Whoever had submitted it had done so in person, at the counter on a Thursday afternoon. The filing clerk remembered a woman in professional attire who had paid cash. The county's security footage, if they requested it promptly, would likely show her face. And then Sonia found something. She had been searching public business records and came across a filing for a company called Whitmore Residential Holdings, LLC, incorporated 6 weeks ago in Delaware. The registered agent was a name neither Renee nor Diane recognized. But among the publicly listed contacts associated with the LLC was an email address. The address contained Celeste's last name. They were setting up the structure to receive the property, Diane said. She was not visibly surprised. She was making notes. So the transfer wasn't just to Ethan and Celeste personally. It was to a shell company they created specifically for this purpose. Which means, Renee said, they intended to eventually sell the property through the LLC, which would complicate any attempt to recover it through a straightforward challenge to the transfer. Right, they were building in a buffer. Diane looked up from her notes. This is not a spontaneous scheme. This is something that was planned and structured over a period of months. I had known that already. But hearing it stated in those precise terms, at my kitchen table, with my husband's old photographs on the wall, and the rose bushes just visible through the darkening window. It settled something in me that I hadn't realized was still unsettled. This wasn't desperation. This wasn't Celeste and Ethan in over their heads making a terrible decision in a moment of panic. This was a plan. By 6 that evening, Diane had drafted the framework of an emergency motion to invalidate the property transfer, a formal objection to the guardianship petition, with supporting documentation, and a request for a court-appointed independent medical evaluator to counter the fraudulent assessment. She had also placed a call to the county's Elder Financial Exploitation Unit, which was, she explained to me, a division specifically set up to handle exactly this kind of case. They'll want to open their own investigation, she said. That's separate from the civil side that's potentially criminal. Depending on what they find. How criminal, I asked. Bluntly, because I was tired and it was 6 in the evening, and I was past the point of softening my questions. Diane looked at me. She clicked the pen twice. Wire fraud for the electronic components of the filing. Forgery, obviously. Elder financial exploitation is a felony in this state. Depending on what the investigation turns up about intent regarding the insurance policy. She stopped. Margaret, I want to be careful here because intent is hard to prove, and I don't want to state things definitively that we don't have evidence for yet. But if the evidence supports that the insurance policy was a knowing part of the plan, she said carefully, that's a different category of criminal exposure. I nodded. I thought about my son, about the specific quality of the silence, after I asked him whether he had known about the documents, and the single word that had come out of it. I want you to keep building the case, I said. Whatever the evidence supports, I want it documented. Even if it implicates Ethan fully, I said. Yes. Diane held my gaze for a moment. Then she wrote something on her legal pad and said, okay. That night, after Renee and Diane and Sonia had gone, I sat alone in the kitchen, with the documents still spread across the table. I had one more piece of information I hadn't shared with them yet. Not because I was hiding it, I intended to tell Diane in the morning, but because I had needed a few hours with it myself first. At 5:30, in a gap between phone calls, I had looked up Daniel Frew, the lawyer who had come to my door. He had a legitimate practice, a small one, mostly real estate work. But 3 years ago, he had been the subject of a bar complaint filed by an elderly woman in the eastern part of the state. The complaint alleged that Frew had facilitated a property transfer on her behalf without her knowledge or consent. The complaint had been withdrawn after a settlement. The terms were confidential, so this was not the first time. That meant Frew had done this before and had survived it, had navigated a complaint and a settlement, and emerged with his license intact and his practice running. Which meant he had experience with the risks, which meant he was probably very confident that he could do it again. I wrote his name at the top of a fresh page. Then I wrote Celeste's name. Then the LLC. Then Dr. Carl Misson, the physician whose name and credentials had been stolen to fabricate a medical evaluation of a woman he had never met. I drew lines between them. Then I sat back and looked at what I had built, the shape of the thing, the way the pieces connected. I thought about the Blackwood Trust. Renee had told me the full current value that afternoon, confirming a number she updated for me every quarter, $83,400,000, plus accumulated interest on the most recent reinvestment round. $83 million, sitting in a trust structure managed by a woman they had never heard of, entirely invisible to anyone who looked at my life from the outside, entirely inaccessible through any forged document, any fraudulent property transfer, any guardianship petition, because the trust had been designed, very deliberately and very carefully, to be separate from everything else. They had come for a house worth $420,000. They had no idea what was sitting underneath. I folded the fresh page in half. Then I stood, turned off the kitchen light, and went upstairs. I took a long shower. I put on clean clothes. I stood at the bedroom window and looked out at the street for a while. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and I let myself feel, just for a moment, the specific exhaustion of a day in which you discover that the people you loved are capable of things you cannot fully comprehend. It is a particular kind of tired that has nothing to do with sleep. It is the kind that settles into the part of you that trusted, and now has to figure out what to do with all that trust, now that there is nowhere left to put it. I thought about Gerald. I thought about what he would say if he were sitting beside me right now. He would not say something wise or comforting, because that was not his style. He would probably say something practical and slightly sideways, The kind of observation that sounds minor but points at the right thing. He had a gift for that. He always knew where to point. I thought I knew what he would say right now. He would say, "You already know what to do. You just need to decide that you're willing to do it." I sat there a little longer. Then I decided. At 8 in the morning the next day, Celeste called my regular cell phone. I let it ring twice. Then I answered. Margaret, her voice was back to warm, the version she used when she wanted something. I just wanted to check in. I know yesterday was a lot to process. I want you to know we're not trying to make this difficult. I appreciate that, I said. My voice was tired. I made sure it sounded that way. I know it's hard, she said, but honestly, the house is too much for you to manage on your own. We're thinking about your well-being. You could stay with us. We have the guest room, and we could help you find something smaller, something easier, something that fits where you are in life right now. Where I am in life right now. That's very thoughtful, I said. Have you had a chance to look at the documents more carefully? I have, I said. I'm still trying to understand some of the language. Legal documents are confusing. A small pause, the sound of someone recalibrating. She had expected either resistance or capitulation, and I had given her neither. I had given her confusion, a slightly overwhelmed older woman trying to make sense of paperwork. Of course, she said warmly. Do you want me to have Daniel explain things? He's very patient. Maybe, I said. I'll think about it. Can you give me one more day? A beat, then, of course. We just need to keep things moving forward, you understand. The timeline is, I understand, I said. I just need one more day. Absolutely. The warmth, steady and practiced. Call me anytime. We hung up. I set the phone on the table and looked at Diane, who was sitting across from me with her pen poised. She raised an eyebrow. One more day, I said. That's how much time we have before she realizes I'm not confused. Let's use it. Diane uncapped her pen. Outside, the morning had turned bright and cold, the kind of clarity that comes in late October when the air is thin enough to see through. I looked out at the rose bushes, bare-stemmed and patient, waiting out the winter the way they always did. The thing about roses, and Gerald knew this, which is why he planted them, is that they look dead when they're dormant. They look like nothing is happening. But underneath, the root system is deep and intact, and quietly preparing for what comes next. I turned back to Diane. Let's start with Fru, I said. Tell me everything we can prove about that bar complaint. The day before the confrontation, I slept poorly. Not because I was afraid. I had moved past somewhere around the second night, when the fear had burned itself down to something quieter and more useful. What kept me awake was the particular restlessness of someone who has prepared as thoroughly as she can, and now has nothing left to do but wait. I lay in the dark listening to the old house settle around me, and I thought about all the small decisions that had led to this moment. Patents I had quietly protected. The trust Gerald and I had spent 3 careful evenings structuring. The flip phone in the third dresser drawer. Each of those choices had seemed at the time like ordinary caution. The kind of thing a person does, not because they expect disaster, but because they understand that life is unpredictable, and the only real protection against the unpredictable is preparation you hope never to need. I had needed it. At 4 in the morning, I gave up on sleep, put on my robe, and went downstairs. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the lights low and the documents arranged in front of me one final time. Not because I needed to review them, I had the details memorized by then. Every discrepancy, every forged line, every piece of evidence Diane had gathered and organized into the 2 bankers' boxes now sitting in my hallway. I sat with them because I needed to look at the full shape of what had been done to me before I faced the people who had done it. It helped to see it clearly, all of it without softening. The forged power of attorney, the fraudulent property transfer filed with a retired notary's stolen seal, the fabricated medical evaluation from a doctor who had never laid eyes on me, the guardianship petition designed to strip me of my legal autonomy, the shell company built to absorb my home, the insurance policy they intended to eventually collect. Each piece had been constructed carefully, and each piece connected to the others, with the particular logic of a plan that had been worked out over months, not days. This was not the work of panic. This was the work of calculation. And my son had known. I thought about that while the coffee cooled. I thought about the specific quality of his silence on the phone, the way he had said the word yes flat and tight, like something being admitted rather than stated. I had been turning that yes over in my mind for 2 days, looking at it from different angles, trying to find the interpretation that made it smaller or more complicated than it appeared. I couldn't find one. He had known about the forged documents, which meant he had known, at minimum, that his wife was committing fraud. Whether he had known the full scope, the guardianship petition, the insurance policy, the shell company, the long-term intent was something I still didn't know with certainty. Diane believed the evidence would ultimately show that Ethan had been told enough to understand the broad shape of the plan, but had deliberately avoided asking questions that would have forced him to know more than he could live with. That is a specific kind of cowardice. It is the cowardice of a man who wants the outcome without having to look directly at the mechanism. I had raised him better than that, or I thought I had. That was its own particular grief, not just that he had done this, but that somewhere between the boy who had cried in my kitchen over a girl and the man who said yes on the phone, something had shifted in him that I had not seen coming. I had not seen it because I had not wanted to, because he was my son, and parents are the last people to stop believing in the person they knew before the world got to them. Sitting there in my kitchen at 4 a.m, I had to admit that I had failed to see him clearly. That was mine to carry. It didn't excuse what he had done, but it was mine. By 6, I had showered, dressed, and was on the phone with Diane. "Are we ready?" I asked. "My team arrives at your house at 8, she said. 2 investigators, my associate Kevin and myself. The forensic accountant is coming at 8:30. I want everything laid out before they arrive." A pause. "How are you doing?" "I'm fine," I said, Margaret. "I'm tired and I'm angry and I'm ready," I said. "Is that better?" "Much," she said. They arrived at 8 on the dot. Diane in a dark blazer with her legal pad, and the pen she never stopped clicking. Kevin, her associate, who was younger than I expected, and moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had set up rooms like this before. 2 investigators from the Elder Financial Exploitation Unit, a man named Roy Stanhope, heavyset and unhurried, and a woman named Lila Marsh, who wore her authority lightly and took in my kitchen with a single comprehensive glance that I respected immediately. Renee arrived at 8:15. With 2 more boxes of trust documents and the restraining order application that had been filed with the court the previous afternoon, temporarily blocking any further action on the property transfer pending the hearing. The forensic accountant, a man named Harris Pratt, who communicated almost entirely in precise declarative sentences, arrived at 8:25 and set up his laptop at the far end of the table with the focused silence of someone who finds other people's voices moderately inconvenient. By 8:50, my kitchen table had been transformed. The forged power of attorney laid in a protective sleeve, the fraudulent property transfer documents beside it. Celeste's signature on the LLC incorporation papers, printed and flagged. The bar complaint against Daniel Frew, with the settlement documentation. Security footage still from the county records office, showing a woman in professional attire at the filing counter, a printout, grainy but usable. The fraudulent medical evaluation, with a letter from the actual doctor. Carl Misson's office, confirming he had never examined me and that his credentials had been used without his knowledge or consent. That letter had come through yesterday afternoon. And Dr. Misson himself had been, to say the least, furious. There was also a signed statement from Patricia Owens describing the woman who had entered my home while I was at the doctor. And Harris Pratt's preliminary financial analysis, which detailed the debt structure Celeste and Ethan had accumulated $11 million across 4 different creditors, 2 of which were entities that did not advertise themselves publicly. $11 million. When Renee had told me the number the previous morning, I had sat with it for a long time. $11 million was not a gambling debt or a bad investment quarter. $11 million was a sustained pattern of reckless financial behavior, compounded and spiraling. The kind of debt that changes how a person sees the world, that makes things that were previously unthinkable start to look like options. Diane had walked me through the financial picture piece by piece. Celeste had begun moving money into high-risk investments 2 years into their marriage. She had concealed most of it from Ethan initially. Diane believed this, and then, when the losses became impossible to hide, had brought him in not as a partner but as a resource. His name, his family connection, his mother. He had not been the architect of the scheme, but he had agreed to be its instrument. That was the part I kept returning to. He had agreed, Margaret. Diane's voice from the other side of the table. They just turned onto your street. I had positioned myself at the kitchen window. I could see the car, a silver sedan, moving slowly, the way people drive when they're looking for a parking spot or working up to something. Stopped in front of the house. I watched Celeste step out first. She was wearing a different coat today, gray, structured, expensive. The kind of coat that communicates seriousness without trying too hard. She had thought about what to wear to this. She had prepared for a scene in which she would need to look authoritative. Ethan got out of the passenger side. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking at the house. I watched him from the window, and what I noticed, what I would not have let myself notice 2 days ago, was that he looked tired. Not regretful, not conflicted, just tired. The way a person looks when they have been carrying a heavy thing for a long time and have stopped examining what the thing actually is. Daniel Frew arrived in a separate car 30 seconds later. He had a leather portfolio, same as before, and the particular professional stillness I had noticed on his first visit. He was used to these moments. He had done this before. What he had never done before was walk into a room that was ready for him. I stepped back from the window. "They're coming in," I said. I opened the door before they knocked. Celeste startled slightly, just a fraction, just enough that I noticed, and then rearranged her expression into something warm and patient. "Margaret, good morning." "Come in," I said. My voice was steady and quiet. "All three of you." She stepped inside. Her eyes moved quickly around the entry hallway, registered nothing out of the ordinary, because the kitchen was around the corner, and from the hallway you couldn't see what was waiting. Ethan came in behind her. He didn't look at me directly. Frew came last, pulling the door closed behind him, with the deliberate care of a man who understood that physical spaces were a kind of communication. "We should sit down," I said. "We have a lot to go through." "Of course," Celeste said. "We brought some additional documents that might help clarify." She came around the corner into the kitchen. She stopped. Ethan nearly walked into her back. I watched it happen the moment when what she was seeing registered. The table, the people Diane, calm behind her legal pad. Kevin seated with a recorder on the table in front of him. Lila Marsh and Roy Stanhope, standing along the far wall with a quality of stillness that I imagine is taught in some kind of professional training because it communicates authority without any visible effort. Renee, with the banker's boxes stacked beside her chair. Harris Pratt, not looking up from his laptop. Celeste stood in the entrance to my kitchen for 2 full seconds without speaking. Then she said, "What is this?" "This is a conversation," I said. I moved past her and took my seat at the head of the table. "Please sit down." She did not sit immediately. Her eyes moved across the faces in the room, then to the documents spread on the table. I watched her take in the layout document by document, face by face, and I watched the calculation happening behind her eyes. She was assessing. She was trying to determine how much I had, how quickly they could reframe this, whether there was still a version of the next 10 minutes that went in her favor. Daniel Frew, to his credit, understood the room faster than she did. His face had gone very neutral. That was a professional reflex. He had been in adversarial rooms before, just not ones where the other side had done their homework so thoroughly. Ethan sat down without being asked. He sat in the chair closest to the door, which I noticed but didn't remark on. Celeste pulled out the chair across from Diane and sat with the controlled composure of someone who has decided that composure is the only available card. "I didn't realize there would be other people here," she said. "I imagine not," I said. Diane placed her hand on the stack of documents in front of her. "Mrs. Voss Holloway, my name is Diane Cho. I'm representing Margaret Holloway in connection with several matters that have arisen in the past week. These are investigators Stanhope and Marsh from the county's Elder Financial Exploitation Unit, who are here in an observational capacity. This conversation is being recorded with Mrs. Holloway's full consent." Celeste's eyes went to the recorder on the table, then back to Diane. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said. "Possible," Diane said pleasantly. "Let's try to clear it up. Beginning with this," she lifted the protective sleeve containing the forged power of attorney and set squarely in the center of the table. "This document purports to transfer Margaret Holloway's primary residence to Whitmore Residential Holdings, LLC. It bears a signature in the name of Margaret Eleanor Holloway and a notarization stamp from a notary public whose registration lapsed in 2019. We've obtained verification from the County Records Office confirming this notary's status and the date the registration expired. We've also retained a forensic document examiner who has provided a written preliminary assessment confirming that the signature on this document was digitally fabricated. The full written report will be submitted to the court by Friday morning." Celeste said nothing. "We've additionally obtained documentation from the actual doctor. Carl Misson," Diane continued, her voice entirely level, the way water is level. confirming that he has never examined Margaret Holloway and that his credentials were used without his knowledge or consent to produce a fraudulent medical evaluation. Dr. Misson has retained his own counsel and intends to pursue the matter separately. She paused. Do you want me to continue, or would you like to say something first? Celeste looked at Fru. Fru looked at the documents on the table. His face was doing the work of revealing nothing, but the stillness of it had changed quality. It was no longer the professional stillness of a man at ease. It was the stillness of a man doing calculations he didn't like. I'd like to consult with my client, he said. Of course, Diane said. Though I should mention that we've already filed an emergency motion to invalidate the property transfer and a formal objection to the guardianship petition with supporting documentation. Those were filed yesterday afternoon. The court has issued a temporary order blocking any further action on the property pending the hearing, which is scheduled for. She glanced at Kevin. November 18th, Kevin said. November 18th, Diane repeated. So the property is not going anywhere in the interim. And neither is Margaret. Fru leaned toward Celeste and said something quietly. Celeste's jaw tightened. She shook her head, a small, quick movement that was the first uncontrolled thing she had done since she walked in. Ethan had not said a word. I looked at him. He was staring at the table, not at any particular document, just at the surface of it, the way you stare at something when you're not really seeing it. His hands were flat on his thighs. He had the look of a man who is standing at the edge of a thing he cannot come back from and is just now fully understanding that. Ethan, I said. He looked up. His eyes were red at the rims. He had not slept either. I need you to understand what's on this table, I said. Not as your mother telling you something. As someone who has spent 4 days documenting what was done to her. I gestured at the spread of documents. This is not a misunderstanding. This is evidence of a coordinated scheme. The forgery, the guardianship petition, the shell company. I paused. The insurance policy. Something shifted in his face at that last one. A small movement around the eyes. And then I saw something I hadn't expected. Confusion. Not the performed confusion of someone trying to play innocent. Real confusion. The confusion of someone who has just heard a detail they hadn't known about. I watched him carefully. What about the insurance policy? He said. Celeste turned to him sharply. It was the first uncontrolled movement she had made that was directed at him rather than at us. Ethan, what about the insurance policy? He said again. His voice had changed. Something had come into it, not anger yet, but the precursor to anger, the moment when a person realizes they have been used. Your wife investigated your mother's life insurance policy, Diane said. The face value payout in the event of Margaret's death names you as primary beneficiary. Policy was identified, along with the property, as a financial asset to be accessed through the guardianship proceeding. Ethan stared at Diane. Then he turned and looked at Celeste. Celeste, he said, just her name, quiet like a door clicking shut. Don't, she said. Don't do this right now. We talked about the long-term picture. You know what we talked about. We talked about the house, he said. We talked about getting money to cover the Harmon debt. We did not talk about, he stopped. His throat moved. We did not talk about that. The Harmon debt, Roy Stanhope said, from his position along the wall. His voice was calm and conversational, the voice of a man who has heard many things in many rooms. That would be Harmon Capital Holdings, the one with the outstanding balance of approximately $3.2 million? Ethan's head turned toward Stanhope. How do you know about that? We've been building a financial picture, Stanhope said. We have records of 4 creditors. Harmon is one. The others are stopped, Fru said. He held up a hand. My clients are not answering questions without separate representation present. Whatever you believe you have, this conversation ends now. He began to gather himself, reaching for his portfolio. You're welcome to leave, Diane said. The motion and the objection are already filed. The investigation is already open. She paused, and Mr. Fru, while you're making your exit, I'd encourage you to review the materials we've obtained regarding the 2021 bar complaint filed against you by Norma Whitfield, specifically the circumstances under which that complaint was withdrawn. We've been in contact with Ms. Whitfield's family. Fru froze, not for long, 2 seconds, maybe 3. Then he closed the portfolio and stood, his face back to professional neutral. The 2 seconds were visible to everyone in the room, and everyone in the room had been watching for exactly that. I'll be in touch with your office, he said to Diane. Then he walked out of my kitchen without looking at either of his clients. The sound of the front door opening and closing was very clear in the silence he left behind. Celeste sat very still. Whatever composure she had been maintaining, she was working hard to keep it now. The room had shifted, and she knew it. The shape of the next weeks, the court hearing, the investigation, the bar complaint against Frew, the forensic document examiner's report was visible to her in a way it hadn't been 20 minutes ago. She was calculating, I could see it. What she did next surprised me. She turned to me, Margaret. Her voice had lost the warmth entirely. What was underneath was something I hadn't heard from her before, not anger, exactly, but something rawer. Something that might have been close to desperation if it had been better disguised. I know how this looks. I know what you think happened here. But Ethan and I were in a very bad situation. The debt is, you don't understand the pressure we've been under. These people, the ones we owe money to, they are not patient people, Margaret. I understand you're frightened, I said. Then you understand why. I understand you're frightened, I said again. And I understand that you decided the correct response to that fear was to forge my signature, fabricate my medical records, file a petition to have me declared legally incompetent, and set up a company to take my home. I held her gaze. I understand all of that. It does not help you. Her jaw set. You could have helped us. If I had just what? Given you the house? If you had just been reasonable. Celeste, I kept my voice even. What you came to this house prepared to do to me is not a failure of my reasonableness. It is a crime. The word sat in the room. Nobody moved. And then Ethan said, in a voice that I barely recognized, how much is the trust worth? Every head in the room turned toward him. He was looking at me. Not with greed, the thing I expected, but with something that looked more like slow, terrible comprehension. Like a man adding up a column of numbers and arriving at a sum he hadn't anticipated. How much is it worth, Mom? I looked at my son for a long moment. I thought about whether to answer. Then I decided that honesty at this point cost me nothing. The current value, I said, is approximately $83 million. The silence that followed was different from the other silences in the room. It had a different weight, a different texture. I watched it move across Ethan's face, the number landing, the implications of the number landing behind it, the understanding that they had come for a $400,000 house, and they had not known, had not thought to ask, had never imagined that the frightened, confused old widow they were evicting had been sitting on something that dwarfed everything they owed by a factor of 7. Celeste made a sound, not a word, just a sound. Ethan looked down at his hands. You never told me, he said. No, I said. All those years, he wasn't accusing me. He was just stating it, the way you state something, when you're trying to get its dimensions. You never told me. I wanted you to build your own life, I said. I didn't want you to build one that was dependent on mine. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very low, and now? I looked at my son, at the man he was, at the choice he had made when he said yes on the phone, at the way he was sitting slumped slightly, hands still flat on his thighs, with the particular posture of someone who has just watched the ground shift under them and is not sure what is solid anymore. And now, I said, there's an anti-exploitation clause in the trust. Been there since Gerald and I established it. It disqualifies anyone who attempts to obtain the trust's assets through fraud, coercion, or elder exploitation. I paused. Anyone, Ethan. I need you to understand what that means. He understood. I could see it in his face, not immediately. The way a simple thing lands, but gradually, the way a complex thing assembles itself into meaning. He understood that the inheritance he might have had, that he would have had, eventually, simply by being my son, was gone. Not because of anything I had done or decided in this room. Because of what he had decided weeks ago when he had said yes to his wife and no to his mother without ever once picking up the phone. His eyes went red again. Celeste said something sharp and quiet in his direction. He didn't respond to her. You gave me chances, he said. It wasn't a question. I called you, I said. Gave you an opening. I asked you directly whether you knew about the documents. I know. You said yes, I know, he said. He pressed his hands to his face for a moment. His shoulders shook once, and then he brought them back down. Mom, I know, I said, and I did know. Not everything I didn't know, the full story of how he had gotten from the boy in my kitchen to the man in this room, and I suspected the full story was complicated in ways I hadn't yet seen. But I knew enough. I knew that somewhere along the way, the weight of the debt and the pressure of Celeste and the particular blindness that comes from wanting things to be fine when they are not had eroded something in him that should have held. I knew he was sorry. I also knew that sorry, in this room, with these documents on this table, was just a word. Lila Marsh stepped forward then, in the quiet way she had, and addressed Celeste directly. Mrs. Voss Holloway, I want to advise you at this point that anything further you say in this room may be relevant to the ongoing investigation. You have the right to have an attorney present. She glanced at the door, through which Fru had recently departed. A different attorney, I would suggest, given the circumstances. Celeste stood. She did not look at me. She did not look at Ethan. She picked up her coat from the back of the chair, held it rather than putting it on, and walked out of my kitchen with the particular precision of a person who has decided that the only remaining form of dignity is not to run. The front door closed a second time. Ethan stayed. He stayed in the chair with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the table, and the room moved around him, Marsh and Stanhope conferring quietly, Diane writing rapidly on her legal pad, Kevin gathering recorder and files, Harris Pratt finally closing his laptop with the mild air of a man whose portion of the morning was complete. Renee was watching me from across the table. She had known me for 11 years, and she understood, I think, that what was happening between me and my son right now was not something she could help with. Eventually, the room emptied to just the two of us. Ethan looked up. I didn't know about the insurance, he said. I need you to know that. She told me we were going to. I thought it was just the house. I thought we'd get the house, cover the Harmon debt, get out from under everything. I didn't. I never thought she would believe you, I said. About that part, but not the rest. You knew about the forged documents. He didn't deny it. He just looked at me with the particular expression of someone who has no defense left and knows it. You didn't lose your inheritance today, I said. I had thought about how to say this for 2 days, and I had decided that the plainest version was the truest. You lost it when you chose the paperwork over your mother. He flinched, not dramatically, just a small movement of the face, the kind that can't be performed. I stood up and started clearing the documents from the table. My hands were steadier than I expected them to be. Coffee maker was still on, had been on since 8 in the morning. Poured myself a cup and stood with my back to him for a moment, looking out at the backyard. The rose bushes, bare and patient against the gray October sky. What happens now? Ethan said. That depends on the investigation, I said. I have no control over what the investigators do. I gave them everything I found and everything Diane found. I didn't ask them to go easy on anyone. A pause. Including me? I turned around and looked at my son. Ethan, I said, I have spent 4 days documenting what was done to me. I didn't redact anyone's name. I didn't soften anyone's role. I gave them the truth because the truth is what I have, and because anything less would have been a disservice to myself. I paused. What you did is in those documents. What happens with it is not mine to decide. He looked at the table. He nodded. Once. Slowly, the way a person nods when they are accepting something they cannot argue with. I'm going to need you to leave now, I said. He stood. He was very quiet as he gathered himself. Very careful in the way he moved, like a man trying to take up as little space as possible. He walked to the kitchen doorway and stopped. Mom, he said. I looked at him. He didn't have anything else. He had started the sentence without knowing how to finish it, and we both understood that, and there wasn't anything either of us could do to make that better. I know, I said again. For the 3rd time that morning, he left. I stood at the kitchen window with my coffee, and I watched his car pull away from the curb and drive down Crestwood Lane until it turned the corner and was gone. The street was very quiet after that. Patricia's house across the way had its lights on. I could see a shape moving past the kitchen window, the ordinary rhythm of a morning that had no idea what had just happened 20 feet away. I stood there for a while. Then I set down my coffee, picked up my yellow legal pad, turned to a fresh page, and wrote at the top what needs to happen next. There was still a great deal to do. Court hearings, the criminal investigation, the trust documentation, my property rights to formalize and protect, all of the ordinary, unglamorous machinery of making something right that had been made wrong. I was not done, but for this one moment, standing in my kitchen with the documents on the table and the rose bushes outside and the clock on the wall ticking the way it always did, I let myself feel what had actually happened this morning. They had come to take everything from me. They had walked into my house, expecting a frightened woman. They had found something else entirely. I uncapped my pen and started writing. The weeks after the confrontation were not what people imagine when they think about justice. Justice in the real world does not arrive like a thunderclap. It arrives like weather slow-moving, uneven, preceded by long gray stretches of waiting that nobody thinks to include when they tell the story afterward. I had expected to feel something clean and definitive after they walked out of my kitchen. What I felt instead was exhausted and hollow and slightly unreal, the way you feel after an accident when the adrenaline drains and the body doesn't quite know what to do with itself now that the emergency is technically over. Diane called me that same evening. The county filed the criminal referral this afternoon, she said. Marsh and Stanhope moved fast. The DA's office will review and decide on charges within the next 10 days. All right, I said. Margaret, this is good news. I know it is, I said. I'm just tired. She was quiet for a moment. Diane was not a person who filled silences unnecessarily, which was one of the things I had come to appreciate about her. Get some rest, she said. The next few weeks are going to require you to be present for a lot of things you'd probably rather not be present for. She was right about that. The hearing on November 18th was not a single event, but the beginning of a process that would involve multiple court appearances. The submission of the forensic document examiner's full report, testimony regarding the fraudulent medical evaluation, and the formal disposition of the guardianship petition, which was ultimately dismissed with a notation in the record that it had been filed in bad faith. The judge who handled the dismissal was a woman in her early 60s, with reading glasses not unlike Diane's, and she said, reading from the record, that the evidence of fabrication was, in her words, not ambiguous. She did not say it with any particular heat. She said it the way you state a fact that is so clear it doesn't require elaboration. Property transfer was invalidated 3 days after the hearing. My house was mine again, legally, formally, on paper. Piece of paper that Diane presented to me across her office desk with the same businesslike calm she applied to everything. I held it for a moment, then I folded it and put it in my bag. That's it, I said. Diane permitted herself a small smile. That's it for the civil side. The criminal side is a different timeline. The criminal side was, as she had promised, a different timeline. And it was on the criminal side that the story became something I had not fully anticipated, because it was on the criminal side that the full picture of what Celeste had done finally came into the culminating light, including the parts that Ethan had not known. The first time I sat down with Roy Stanhope formally, not the morning of the confrontation, but a week later, in a conference room at the county building, he walked me through the investigation's findings with the methodical patience of a man who had learned long ago that the facts were more damning than any dramatic presentation of them. Celeste, he explained, had a history, not a criminal history, not yet she had been careful enough for that, but there was a pattern if you looked at it assembled. Before Ethan, she had been briefly married to a man named Philip Renard, a divorce that had concluded with a civil dispute over marital assets. Philip Renard's elderly mother had subsequently reported to local authorities that certain of her financial documents had been accessed without her consent during the period when Celeste was part of the family. The report had gone nowhere, no documentation to support it, no charges filed. But it was there, in a database that investigators knew how to look in. She's done this before, I said, not with surprise. More with the particular feeling of a puzzle piece confirming what the surrounding shape had already suggested. The Renard situation was less organized, Stanhope said. This one was more sophisticated. She had more time, more resources, a clearer target. He paused, clicking his own pen. Apparently all investigators had this habit. The Harmon debt was the trigger. The timeline matches. They took out the last large loan from Harmon Capital 14 months ago. 6 weeks later, she incorporated the LLC. 2 months after that, your neighbor observed the woman entering your property. 14 months. She had been planning this for 14 months. The whole engagement period. The whole 3-month rush to the wedding. All of it had been moving toward a single destination. My house, my accounts, my autonomy, and eventually my life insurance payout. I want to ask you something, I said. Stanhope looked at me. The insurance component, I said. How developed was that part of the plan? He was quiet for a moment. He had a way of pausing before certain answers that told me the answer required care. Plan as we've reconstructed it had 3 phases. The property transfer was phase 1, get the primary asset into the LLC quickly, before you could respond. The guardianship was phase 2, once you were legally declared incompetent. They would control all financial decisions, including any changes to insurance beneficiaries or policy structures. Phase 3, he stopped. Phase 3, I said. Phase 3 was less defined, he said carefully. In the documents we recovered from the LLC's registered server, there's correspondence between Celeste and a third party we're still identifying. The correspondence discusses timeline and mentions the insurance policy's face value. It doesn't explicitly state intent. He looked at me steadily. But context matters. I sat with that for a while. Context matters. I turned those two words over in my mind and understood exactly what Stanhope was telling me without saying it outright. The correspondence didn't need to say the explicit thing to mean it. The architecture of the plan stripped the assets, control the person. Weight had its own logical endpoint. And Celeste, who was systematic and patient and had done something like this before, understood that endpoint. I don't know if I can adequately describe what it feels like to sit in a county building conference room and understand that your life was an item on someone's timeline, that you were a resource to be depleted in stages, that the woman who had smiled at you from the second row of an event hall 7 days before she came to your door with a moving crew had somewhere in her planning, considered what happened after. It is a very particular kind of violation. It is not like anger, which has heat to it. It is colder than that. It is the feeling of something essential being reduced to a number. Kept my hands flat on the conference table, and I breathed through it and I said, "Thank you for telling me." The DA is looking at the full picture, Stanhope said. The charges being considered include forgery, fraud, and elder financial exploitation, all of which are supportable with current evidence. The additional component, he paused again, is under review. I understand, I said. I did understand. The law requires evidence, and evidence requires documentation, and the darkest corners of someone's intentions are often the hardest corners to illuminate. I did not feel bitter about that. I felt something more complicated than bitterness, a kind of clear-eyed acceptance that some things cannot be fully proven, only understood, and that understanding them has to be enough. I thanked Stanhope, shook his hand, and went home. Ethan called 3 days later. I had been expecting the call, though I had not known when it would come. I had thought about, more than once, whether I would answer. I had decided I would, because I was not the kind of person who resolved difficult things through avoidance, and because whatever conversation was coming, I needed to have it while I still had the full picture clearly in my mind. Mom. His voice was different from every other time I had heard it in the past month. The tightness was gone. What was there instead was something rawer, less managed. He had been crying recently, or was close to it. Can we talk? We're talking, I said. A short silence. I mean, can I come over? I looked around my kitchen, the table where the documents had been spread, the window with the rose bushes, my yellow legal pad, still open to the last page I'd written. Yes, I said, come over. He arrived 40 minutes later. He had lost weight, I noticed not dramatically, but enough that I could see it in his face. He was wearing a plain gray sweater, and he hadn't shaved in several days, and he stood on my front step without quite knowing what to do with his hands, which he finally settled on putting in his pockets, which made him look about 16 years old. Come in, I said. We sat at the kitchen table. I did not offer coffee immediately, which under any other circumstances would have been unthinkable. I offer everyone who sits at my table coffee. It's reflexive. But today I sat down across from my son and I let the ordinary social rituals stay out of it, because what was sitting between us was too serious for the comfort of rituals. I left her, he said. I hadn't known that when. The day after I left here. He looked at his hands on the table. I went back to the apartment and I told her I was done. She tried to. She had a lot to say. I let her say it. Then I packed a bag and I went to Marcus's place. Marcus was a friend from college, one I had met twice. I've been there since. All right, I said. I know that doesn't fix anything, he said quickly. I'm not saying it like it fixes anything. I just needed you to know. I know it doesn't fix anything, I said. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, turning something over in his mind, and then he said, Stanhope called me yesterday. They want me to come in and make a formal statement about what I knew and when. You should cooperate fully, I said. I know. He looked up at me. Mom, I need to tell you what actually happened. Not as a defense, just because you deserve to know. I looked at him for a moment. Part of me, the part that was still his mother, that would always be his mother regardless of what the courts decided, or what the trust clause said, wanted to reach across the table. The rest of me sat still and waited, because the mother in me had made some poor decisions in the past few years, by overriding the woman who could see clearly. Tell me, I said. He told me. It took about 40 minutes. He talked in the halting, non-linear way of someone who is not used to confessing things, And is finding the order of events difficult to reconstruct because the emotions are not in chronological order. He told me about the first investment loss 2 years ago, a real estate deal in a market that collapsed faster than anyone had predicted. Then the second, smaller loss, and then the third, and then the moment when Celeste had shown him the full picture of where they actually stood financially, and he had understood financially that they were in serious trouble. He told me about Harmon Capital, which was not a company he would have approached under any other circumstances, but which had been Celeste's contact and had seemed, at the time, like a solution. He told me about the night Celeste had brought up my house. She said it was the logical answer, he said. She said you were alone, the house was too big, that you'd probably want to downsize eventually anyway. She said we could make it. He stopped. She said we could structure it so it was good for everyone. What did you say? He was quiet, Ethan. I said I didn't think you'd go for it, he said. I said you were stubborn, she said. He stopped again, pressed his lips together. She said that was okay, that she knew a way to handle it that wouldn't require a lot of your input. I sat with that, wouldn't require a lot of your input. A way to describe what they had planned that was so thoroughly sanitized of its actual meaning that a person could almost miss it. I thought about whether Ethan had missed it. I thought about the particular human capacity for hearing what we can bear to hear and not hearing the rest. Did you ask her what she meant? I said. He looked at the table. No, that single syllable, quiet and ashamed, told me more than 40 minutes of explanation. Because that was the moment. Not the moment he agreed to the scheme. He had probably agreed to things in pieces, each piece small enough to look past. The moment was the moment he had not asked. The moment he had heard something that any reasonable person would have questioned and had chosen, very deliberately, not to question it. That was a choice. That was the choice. I kept telling myself it would be handled cleanly, he said, that you'd be fine, that we'd sort everything out once we got out from under the debt. I knew the documents were. I knew they weren't right. But I told myself, you told yourself what you needed to, I said. He looked up. Ethan, I am not going to sit here and tell you what you did was forgivable because you didn't ask enough questions. Not asking questions was a choice. Looking away from what Celeste was doing was a choice. Saying yes on the phone when I asked you, that was a choice. I paused. Every one of those choices had a cost, and the cost was real, and it landed on me. I know, he said. Mom, let me finish. I kept my voice level. Not cold, just clear. You are my son. You will always be my son. That is not something that can be undone by what happened this month, and I am not trying to undo it. I looked at him steadily. But being your mother does not mean absorbing the consequences of your choices without naming them. It does not mean pretending that what you did was a misunderstanding rather than a decision. I love you, and that love does not require me to make what you did smaller than it is. He had tears running down his face by the time I finished. He wasn't making any sound, just sitting there with tears on his face, his hands flat on the kitchen table, looking at me with the expression of a man who is hearing something true and has no argument against it. I'm going to cooperate with everything, he said. Whatever they need from me. I'll tell them everything I know. That's the right thing to do, I said. I know it doesn't get back. He stopped. I know it doesn't get back what I had. I knew he meant the inheritance. I knew he was not being mercenary about it, not in this moment, with tears on his face and his hands on my table. He was acknowledging a loss. The particular loss of something he had never been told he had, that he had now lost for reasons that were entirely his own making. No, I said, it doesn't. We sat quietly for a while after that. Kitchen clock ticked. Outside, a car went past. The refrigerator made its small hum. Then, because I am still his mother, and I cannot fully help it, I got up and made coffee. Celeste was charged 6 weeks after the confrontation. 4 counts. Forgery in the first degree, fraud in connection with a financial institution, elder financial exploitation, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Daniel Frew was charged separately on 3 related counts and surrendered his law license pending the outcome of the proceedings. The Bar Association, it turned out, had been watching Frew for some time. The withdrawn complaint from the Whitfield family had left a flag in the records that had never been fully cleared, and Diane's team contacting the Whitfield family had reopened a thread that the Bar Association was now following with renewed interest. I was not in the room when the charges were filed. Diane called me with the information straightforwardly, the way she delivered all information. How are you feeling? She asked after she'd finished the summary. Like I want to sit down, I said. That's reasonable. I thought I'd feel more, I admitted. I thought when the charges came through it would feel like something finished. It's not finished yet, she said. There's still the trial process. I know. I paused. I thought it would feel different. It usually doesn't, Diane said, not unkindly, just accurately. Justice processes feel bureaucratic because they are bureaucratic. The thing that felt like something was what happened in your kitchen. The rest is paperwork. She was right. The thing that had felt like something was standing at my kitchen table watching Celeste's composure break apart piece by piece. Watching Ethan's face when he understood about the insurance. Watching Fru walk out the door. Those moments had been real and human, and charged with everything the weeks of paperwork that followed were not. Paperwork was necessary, but it was not where the truth had lived. Ethan cooperated with investigators, as he had promised. His cooperation was, Stanhope told me in a later conversation, extensive and credible. He had documented every conversation he could remember, turned over every text and email exchange between himself and Celeste that touched on the plan, and provided testimony that filled in significant gaps in the timeline. His cooperation would affect the outcome of his own legal exposure. Diane had told me early on that Ethan was unlikely to face criminal charges given the evidence of his limited and secondary role, though that was for the DA to determine, not me. I was asked whether I wished to submit a victim impact statement regarding Ethan's involvement. I thought about that for several days. Then I wrote one. I did not write it to help him or to hurt him. I wrote it because the statement was mine to make, and I made it honestly. I described what I had experienced and what it had cost me. I described the phone call in which he said yes. I described the quality of his silence before and after it. I also described the conversation at my kitchen table, where he had sat with tears on his face and told me the truth, and the fact that his cooperation had helped clarify a picture I needed to understand. I gave Diane the statement. She read it in my kitchen, standing at the counter. When she finished, she set it down and said, "This is very fair." I tried, I said. "Most people in your position aren't this fair," she said. "I'm not most people," I said, "and he's not most people to me. That's the whole problem." The civil restoration of my property had been completed quickly, but there were other financial threads that took longer to untangle. The LLC Whitmore Residential Holdings was dissolved through a court order, its assets, such as they were, seized pending the criminal proceedings. The shell company had never held any real assets. Its purpose had been structural, a layer of legal distance between Celeste and the property she intended to absorb. Stripping it away took paperwork and time, but no real drama. The accounts were easier. Nothing had been transferred because they had moved too fast and gotten caught before phase 2 of the plan had begun. My regular accounts remained intact. The Blackwood Trust had never been touched, had never been at risk. Renee reminded me of this more than once, with the gentle persistence of someone who understood that I needed to hear it. What took longer, and what nobody had quite warned me about, was the process of trusting my own financial life again. I had lived simply by choice for many years, and I continued to live simply, but something had shifted in how it felt. I found myself checking my accounts more often than necessary. I found myself rereading documents before signing them, not with paranoia, but with a thoroughness I had not previously applied to things I considered routine. I had always been careful. I became more careful. There is a difference between those two things that is hard to articulate, but that anyone who has had their safety deliberately violated would recognize immediately. Renee noticed. She mentioned it gently in her way. "You're doing what people do after something like this," she said. "It takes time, I know," I said. "You might consider talking to someone." I looked at her. "A therapist," she said, with the mild air of someone who expects mild resistance. "Not because anything is wrong with you. Because what happened to you was genuinely traumatic, and the people who process it well are usually the people who don't try to process it entirely alone." I had never been particularly inclined toward therapy. I come from a generation and a disposition that tends to process things internally, through action, through keeping busy, through the particular therapy of getting things done. But I had also spent enough of my life being right about my own resilience to know when being right was costing me something. "I'll think about it," I said. "That's not a no," Renee said. "It's not," I agreed. Patricia Owens came over one evening in late November with a casserole and sat at my kitchen table for 3 hours. She was one of the few people in my immediate life who had watched the events of the past weeks unfold in real time, not through updates and summaries, but through the actual visible texture of it. She had seen the moving truck. She had given me the information about the woman who had entered my house. She had noticed, in the weeks since, the cars that had come and gone, the occasional presence of Diane or Renee or investigators, the fact that I had declined 3 of her dinner invitations in a row, because I had court-related obligations on each of those evenings. She was worried about me. In the particular way, Patricia worried about things not intrusively, not with questions I hadn't invited, but with presence. She showed up with casseroles. She texted to see if I needed anything from the grocery store. She was, in the oldest and most reliable sense of the word, a neighbor. We ate at the kitchen table, and she let me talk, and did not offer opinions unless I asked for them, which is the rarest and most valuable conversational gift another person can give. At one point she said, "Do you think Ethan really didn't know about all of it?" I thought about it. I had been thinking about it for weeks, turning the question over the way you turn a stone in your hand, looking at all its sides. "I think he knew enough that not knowing the rest was a choice," I said. "I think he made the choice and then buried it so thoroughly that by the time everything happened, he had genuinely convinced himself his hands were mostly clean." "Is that better or worse than knowing everything?" she asked. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Some days it seems better. Some days it seems like its own kind of worse." Patricia nodded. "What happens to him?" "The DA's office hasn't indicated charges," I said. "His cooperation has been they've noted it. Diane thinks he'll avoid prosecution. I don't know whether that's the right outcome or not. I've stopped trying to decide what the right outcome is for other people." "What about you two?" I looked at my coffee cup. "I don't know that either." "You still love him," Patricia said, not accusingly, just stating what she could see. "He's my son," I said. "That doesn't stop. I don't know that it should stop loving someone is not the same thing as trusting them or protecting yourself from them or deciding how much access to your life they're allowed to have." I paused. "I can love him and also know that trust isn't something I can give back quickly, that it has to be rebuilt from something real. And I don't know yet if he's willing to do the work that rebuilding requires." Patricia reached across the table and put her hand over mine for a moment. She didn't say anything. She just did that, and then went back to her casserole. That was the right thing. That was exactly the right thing. Celeste's attorney, a new one, not Frew, entered a not guilty plea on her behalf at the arraignment in early December. I was not surprised. I had not expected a quick resolution. Criminal cases move at their own pace, and the one thing Diane had been consistent about was managing my expectations around timeline. "This will take as long as it takes," she had said. "What matters is that the evidence is solid, and it is solid." The evidence was solid. I had seen enough of it assembled, spread on my own kitchen table, to understand that. The forensic document examiner's full report was 42 pages. The financial records Stanhope's team had assembled were more than 100. Dr. Carl Misson had agreed to testify, and his fury had not diminished. If anything, it had sharpened, focused by weeks of dealing with the reputational and administrative fallout of having his credentials used to fabricate a document. I had thought early on that the moment the charges were filed would feel like an ending of some kind. I had been wrong about that. The charges were not an ending. They were a formalization of a process that had started. The morning I closed the door on Celeste and the moving crew, and that would continue through hearings and testimony, and eventually, one day, a verdict. What felt like an ending, or more precisely, like a kind of resolution. Quieter and more interior thing than ending was something that happened on a Thursday evening in late November when I sat down at my kitchen table with nothing in front of me. No documents, no legal pads, no phone calls scheduled. No investigators coming. Just the table and the coffee and the clock. I sat there for about 20 minutes doing nothing. Then I got up, went to the hall closet, and got out the box of photographs I had been meaning to organize for 3 years. Gerald's photographs mostly. Family pictures from the years before he died. Some from before that are early years, the apartment in the city, the first house, the garden Gerald started and I continued. I sat at the table until nearly midnight going through them. My hands were fine, my breathing was fine. I looked at Gerald's face across the decades, young and serious, then middle-aged and starting to soften at the edges, then older, the way he had looked in the last good years, comfortable in himself in the way that some people achieve and some never do. I thought about what he would have said about all of this. Not the wise or practical version, the real version. What would Gerald have actually said if he had been there? I thought probably would have said something profane, which was a habit of his that I had always publicly discouraged, and privately found endearing. And then he would have said, "You handled it. I knew you would." I sat there, with the photographs spread across the table, and let that settle. I had handled it. Not perfectly, there had been moments I wasn't proud of, things I had said or not, ways I had been slower than I should have been, or less clear than I needed to be. The human version of handling something is never the clean version. It is the version with wrong turns in it, with 4 in the morning coffee and shaking hands, and the particular uncertainty of not knowing, day by day, whether what you're doing is going to be enough. It had been enough. I put the photographs back in the box, except for one, a photograph of Gerald in the backyard, his sleeves rolled up, standing beside the rose bushes, the year he planted them. Young rose bushes, barely knee-high. He was squinting against the sun, and he looked entirely satisfied. I set that photograph on the kitchen counter, where I could see it. Then I turned off the lights and went upstairs. Outside, the first snow of the season had started, very quiet, covering the garden and the rose bushes and the street and the whole sleeping neighborhood in something clean and temporary and white. By spring, the roses would be back. They always came back. The trial began on a Tuesday in March. 7 months after Celeste had stood on my front walk in her camel-colored coat, pointing at my house like she already owned it. March in this part of the country is the most dishonest month. It looks like spring from the window. The light has changed. The snow is gone. The bare branches of things have that faint readiness to them. But step outside, and the cold is still there, underneath, waiting. I had always found March slightly untrustworthy for exactly that reason. Something presenting itself as one thing while being another. I thought about that as I sat in the second row of the courtroom on the first morning, in a dark blazer I had bought specifically for this, because I had decided, very deliberately, that I was going to look like exactly what I was, a woman who had come prepared. Diane was at the table to my left, organized and still. Kevin beside her with his files. Renee sat next to me in the gallery, close enough that I could feel the steadiness of her presence without either of us having to say anything about it. Patricia had offered to come. I had told her I was fine, which was partially true. I was fine the way a person is fine, who has decided that fine is the only option she is willing to consider. Celeste came in with her attorney, a man named Gerald Park, no relation to my late husband, a fact I noted with a small internal grimace at the universe's timing, and sat at the defense table without looking toward the gallery. She was dressed carefully, dark clothes, minimal jewelry. She had understood that the version of herself she had worn to my door, the camel coat, the practiced warmth, the authority of someone who expects to win, was not useful here. She was performing a different role now, composed, subdued, wrongly accused. I had watched her perform roles for the 7 days I had known her before she came to my door. I recognized the performance. I did not think the jury would be as familiar with it as I was. But that was Diane's job, not mine. I was there to testify. That was my job. I testified on the 3rd day. Diane had prepared me thoroughly, not by coaching me on what to say, but by walking me through the structure of the examination so that nothing surprised me. The goal is clarity, she had said. You know what happened. Your job is to communicate it in a way that 12 people who weren't there can follow. That's all. That sounds simple, I said. It is simple, she said. It's also the hardest thing. She was right about both. I took the stand and I told the truth, which was the only thing I had available and the only thing that had ever actually served me. I described the Tuesday morning, the truck, the camel coat, the manila envelope, the signature with the middle name I hadn't used since Reagan's 2nd term. I described the flip phone in the 3rd dresser drawer and the call to Renee and the phrase I had used, "Open the Blackwood Trust." I described the 4 days of evidence gathering, the confrontation in my kitchen, the moment Celeste walked in and saw what was waiting for her. Gerald Park cross-examined me for about 90 minutes. He was skilled and he was methodical, and he had clearly identified the areas where he thought my account was vulnerable. He pushed at the idea that I might have signed documents I didn't remember signing. He suggested, with practiced delicacy, that a woman of my age, living alone, dealing with grief and isolation, might have moments of confusion she wasn't fully aware of. I looked at him steadily across the courtroom. "Mr. Park," I said, "I am 69 years old. I have an engineering background. I managed a private trust structure for 3 decades. I identified a forged signature by recognizing a middle name I stopped using in 1987, and I assembled a legal response in 4 days that resulted in a criminal prosecution. At what point in that sequence would you like to locate my confusion? There was a sound in the gallery. Not laughter, not quite. Something adjacent to it. Diane's expression did not change. But I had known her long enough by then to see the small thing that happened around her eyes. Park moved on. He spent time on the question of Ethan, implying that if my own son had been involved, surely I bore some responsibility for the family dynamic that had produced the situation. I understood what he was doing. He was trying to muddy the picture, to introduce enough complexity that the jury might find reasonable doubt in the fog. My son made choices I cannot defend, I said. I am not here to defend them. I am here because someone forged my name on legal documents, attempted to have me declared mentally incompetent through a fabricated medical evaluation, and filed a petition to strip me of the right to make my own decisions. Those things happened to me. The state of my family relationships doesn't change what happened to me. Park had no useful follow-up to that. He wrapped up the cross-examination shortly afterward. I stepped down from the stand and walked back to my seat in the gallery, and Renee put her hand briefly on my arm, and I sat down and looked straight ahead at the courtroom and breathed. The jury deliberated for 2 days. 2 days is not a long time in absolute terms, but it is a very long time when you are waiting inside it. I did not sit at the courthouse during deliberations. Diane told me there was no useful reason to, that juries operated on their own clock, regardless of who was present in the hallway. I went home. I cooked things I didn't especially want to eat. I reorganized 2 closets, which is what I do when I need to do something with my hands and cannot think of anything more productive. On the evening of the first day, I sat on the edge of my bed and I thought about Celeste, which I had been trying not to do, because thinking about Celeste while waiting for a verdict felt like a form of superstition. But sitting there in the quiet of the room where I had slept for 31 years, I allowed myself to think about her honestly. She had been desperate. I understood desperation. I had never been in the particular financial desperation she was in, but I understood the sensation of looking at your life and seeing a gap between where you are and where you need to be that seems too large to cross through ordinary means. I understood the way desperation can narrow your vision until certain things that should be clearly wrong start to look, under the particular light of your own fear, like options. What I did not understand, what I had never been able to locate in myself, turning the whole situation over again and again, was the specific quality of coldness required to look at a 69-year-old woman living alone in her late husband's house and see not a person but a resource. Plan over 14 months the systematic dismantling of her autonomy. To walk to her door with a moving crew, to have, somewhere in the architecture of your plan, a phase 3 that considered what happened when she was no longer there at all. I did not understand that, and I had come to believe, sitting in the quiet of my bedroom, that not understanding it was actually the right response. The appropriate response, that some things should remain incomprehensible to a person who is not built for them. The jury came back on a Thursday afternoon. Diane called me at 2:15. Guilty, she said. All 4 counts. I sat down on the nearest chair, which happened to be the kitchen chair, the one I had been sitting in when everything started. All 4, I said. All 4, she confirmed. Sentencing is in 6 weeks. Given the number of counts and the nature of the offense, elder exploitation carries significant mandatory minimums. In this state, the recommendation will be substantial. What about Frew? His case is separate, scheduled for May. But with Celeste's conviction on record and the bar's parallel proceeding, his position is not strong. A pause. Margaret, it's done. I sat there for a moment with the phone in my hand and the afternoon light coming through the kitchen window, at the angle it came through, in late March, low and long, and catching the dust motes over the table. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. Thank you, Diane, I said. For everything. It was the right case, she said. I'm glad we could make it stick. I hung up. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that, not thinking about the verdict or the sentencing or the 6 weeks ahead. Just sitting in my kitchen in the house that was mine, that was legally and completely and unambiguously mine, where the photographs were on the walls, and Gerald's photograph was on the counter, and the rose bushes were outside beginning, very quietly, to think about spring. I sat there and I let it be over. The sentencing happened 6 weeks later, on a Thursday in early May. Celeste received 7 years on the elder financial exploitation count, with concurrent sentences on the remaining counts. Gerald Park appealed immediately, which Diane had anticipated. The appeal process would take time. None of it surprised me. The legal system is long and procedural, and often unsatisfying in its pace, and I had made my peace with that somewhere around the third month of waiting. What mattered was the verdict. What mattered was that the record existed, that what had been done to me was documented, formally and permanently, in a way that could not be erased. Frew entered a guilty plea in May, 2 weeks before his scheduled trial. He received a suspended sentence, 2 years probation, and the permanent revocation of his law license. The Bar Association's action was swift and final. He would not be practicing law again. I did not feel triumphant about any of it. I want to be honest about that, because the triumphant version of this story is cleaner and more satisfying, and not what I actually experienced. What I experienced was something closer to completion, the particular feeling of a thing that has been left open being finally, formally closed. Not joy, not relief exactly, something quieter than both, something that required no audience. Ethan was not charged. The DA's office determined that his cooperation, combined with the evidence establishing Celeste as the architect of the scheme, made prosecution unlikely to succeed and not in the public interest. Diane told me this in a phone call, with the neutral delivery of someone who understood I had complicated feelings about it, and was not going to presume to tell me what those feelings should be. "How do you feel?" Renee asked me when I told her. "I think it's the right call," I said. "I also think the right call can still be hard to sit with." "That's a very honest answer," she said. "I'm trying to be honest about more things," I said. It turns out I was honest about most things, but not everything. I wasn't honest with myself about Ethan for a long time. I saw things, and I explained them away, and I called that love. I'm trying to learn the difference. Ethan reached out in April, while the appeal was still pending. He had been in contact periodically, since the conversation at my kitchen table cautiously, carefully, the way a person reaches toward something they're not sure will hold their weight. He called every few weeks, we talked. The conversations were careful and slightly formal, which was its own kind of strange, because we had never been formal people with each other, not even in the difficult years when he was a teenager, and we irritated each other regularly and productively. In April, he asked if he could come for dinner. I said yes. He arrived on a Saturday with a bottle of wine I didn't ask about, and the look of a man who had spent some time deciding what to wear, and still wasn't sure he'd gotten it right. He had shaved. He had gained back some of the weight he'd lost in the hard months. He looked, in the aggregate, like someone who was in the process of recovering, not recovered, not finished, but in process. I knew the look. I had seen it in my own mirror. We had dinner. I made the chicken dish Gerald had loved, not because I was making a statement about it, but because it was what I felt like making, and I had stopped organizing my choices around what signals they sent. At some point during dinner, Ethan said, "I've been seeing a therapist." I looked up from my plate. 3 months, he said. I started right after everything. He's helping me understand some things about how I got from being a person I recognized to being a person I didn't. That sounds useful, I said. It's hard, he said. Harder than I expected. She keeps pointing at things I don't want to look at. Good therapists do that, I said. He was quiet for a moment. She asked me about you, about what kind of relationship I hoped we could have going forward. I set down my fork. What did you tell her? I told her I didn't know, he said. I told her I was afraid that whatever I hoped for, I didn't have the right to hope for it. That I'd used up, he stopped. That some things you use up and you can't get back. I looked at my son across the table. He was 34 years old. And he looked tired in the specific way of someone who has been doing real internal work, which is the most exhausting kind. He was not performing. He was not managing me or assessing me or calculating what I could give him. He was just sitting at my kitchen table being honest about being afraid, which was the most like himself I had seen him in a long time. "Ethan," I said, "I'm not going to tell you what you have the right to hope for. It's not mine to give or take away." I paused. "What I can tell you is what I know. I know that I love you. I know that love is real and it is not going to stop. I also know that trust is different from love, and it is not something I can give you on a schedule." I looked at him steadily. "What I can do is be honest with you about where I am. And where I am is, I'm willing. I'm willing to see what rebuilding looks like. But it requires you to keep doing what you're doing. It requires you to keep looking at the things you don't want to look at, even after it stops being immediately necessary, even after the crisis is over, and it would be easy to stop." He nodded slowly. "I'm not going to pretend it will be easy," I said. "I'm not going to pretend I don't still feel the things I feel when I think about that phone call. The yes, I still hear it. I know," he said, "but also not kind of who throws away something real. Because it was damaged, I said. What we have is real. It was real before any of this happened, and it is real now. Real things can be damaged and repaired. They are not the same. After repair, they are different. They carry the repair in them, but different is not the same as ruined. Ethan was quiet for a long time. Then he said very carefully, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes, the trust," he said. "I don't want anything from it. I'm not asking about it for that reason. I've been trying to understand. All those years, you lived the way you lived, and you never said anything." He shook his head slowly. "Why?" I had thought about how to answer this question since the morning in my kitchen when I had told him the number and watched it land on his face. "Because I watched your grandfather depend on an inheritance that never came," I said. "He spent 20 years waiting for his father to die so that his real life could begin. His real life never began. He died waiting." I paused. "I didn't want that for you. I wanted you to build something that was yours, that you had made. I thought if you knew about the money, you would always know it was there, and knowing it was there would change the choices you made." "It might have," he admitted. "It might have," I agreed. "I don't know. I made the best decision I knew how to make with what I understood at the time. It wasn't a perfect decision. There were probably conversations we should have had that we never had." I looked at him. "I'm not without fault in any of this, Ethan. I was not as honest with you as I could have been about certain things. I want to own that." He stared at me. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know I don't have to," I said. "I'm doing it because it's true." He looked away for a moment. When he looked back, his eyes were wet, but he wasn't crying, just sitting with the emotion, keeping it contained the way he had always done. It was a habit of his I had never managed to break when he was young. I had decided somewhere in the past months that it was not mine to break. It was his. He had to decide what to do with it himself. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay," I agreed. We finished dinner. We washed the dishes together in the kitchen, the way we had when he was young, and it was his job, and he complained about it every time with the cheerful insincerity of someone who doesn't actually mind, but has a reputation to maintain. The kitchen felt, for the first time in months, like just a kitchen. When he left, he hugged me at the door. His arms were tight around me for a moment, not a brief social hug, but the kind that means something specific. I hugged him back. I stood on my front step and watched his car drive away, and then I went back inside and stood in my entry hall for a moment in the quiet. It was not fixed. I want to be clear about that. Nothing was fixed. The damage was real, and the repair was going to be slow and uneven and would probably have setbacks I couldn't anticipate. That is how repair works. It is not a line moving steadily in one direction. It is a complicated shape, advancing and retreating, with good weeks and bad weeks, with moments that feel like progress and moments that feel like you haven't moved at all. But it was real, and real is what I had. I sold the house in June, not because I was forced to, not because it held too much pain to stay in, though it held pain, that much was true. I sold it because one evening in late April, I was sitting on the back porch, watching the rose bushes that had finally come back the way they always came back, green and stubborn and certain, and I understood that I was staying in a place out. Stubbornness rather than out of genuine desire. I was staying because leaving would feel like they had won something. And the truth was, they had won nothing, and I no longer needed to prove that to myself through the location of where I slept at night. Gerald had loved the house. I had loved the house when Gerald was in it. What I loved now was the rose bushes, and the photographs, and the clock from the kitchen, and the memory of every ordinary Tuesday evening of our lives together, all of which I could carry with me to wherever I went next. I found a property 40 minutes north, smaller, naturally lit, with a garden space that was, if I was honest, more manageable than what I had been maintaining alone for 11 years. I moved in September. Patricia helped me pack the kitchen, which took 3 times as long as it should have, because every third item produced a story, and she wanted to hear all of them. And I found, to my surprise, that I wanted to tell them. The rose bushes I transplanted, Gerald's 7 roses. They took a few weeks to settle, but they held. The clock I packed myself, wrapped in the same green sweater that had held the flip phone in the 3rd dresser drawer. I carried it in my own car. Some things you don't let the movers handle. The Holloway Elder Justice Foundation was Renee's idea, originally. She raised it in a conversation we had in August, sitting on my back porch in the early evening with the rose bushes behind us and the light going golden, the way it does in August, when the summer is beginning to understand that it is almost finished. You have the resources, she said, and you have the specific experience. And frankly, you have the clarity of someone who has been through the machinery of this kind of exploitation and come out the other side with her faculties intact. She said it with her usual directness, the directness I had been grateful for since the day we met. There are people who don't come out with their faculties intact. There are people who don't come out at all. I thought about that. What would it do? I said. The foundation. Legal support for seniors facing fraudulent guardianship proceedings, she said. Access to the kind of attorneys most people can't afford on their own. Financial forensics. Educational resources on the warning signs of elder financial exploitation. Advocacy for policy changes at the state level. She paused. The kind of infrastructure that would have helped you if you hadn't already had private resources. That last sentence was the one that decided it. If I hadn't already had private resources. I had survived because I had Renee, because I had the flip phone, because I had spent 40 years being careful in ways that most people don't have the resources or the specific knowledge to be. The woman across town who didn't have a Renee. The man in another city whose son had done something similar and who didn't have a Diane Cho or a forensic document examiner or a trust clause carefully worded 20 years ago against exactly this kind of event. They were out there. They were losing. Many of them were losing without ever fully understanding what had been taken from them. Because the people taking it had been very careful about what they let them see. Let's do it, I said. Just like that? Renee said. I've been thinking about it since March, I admitted. You just gave me the vocabulary for it, she smiled. It was a rare enough expression on her face that it was worth noting when it appeared. We incorporated the Holloway Elder Justice Foundation in October, a year to the month after Celeste had stood on my front walk. The first staff member we hired was a woman named Adeze Okonkwo, 31 years old, who had a background in social work and a particular passion for cases involving isolated elderly individuals. She reminded me, in the directness of her attention and the precision of her questions, of a younger version of Diane. I told her so. She said she would take it as a compliment. It was meant as one, I said. The foundation took its first case in November. A 74-year-old woman in the northern part of the state whose nephew had forged a power of attorney and drained $60,000 from her savings account over 18 months. She had been trying to navigate the legal system alone, with a library computer and a legal aid office that was too understaffed to give her case the attention it needed. We gave it the attention it needed. I was not in the room for most of it. Adeze and a litigation attorney we had contracted handled the case management. But I was on the phone with the woman 3 times during the process, because Adeze had thought it would help and she was right. The woman's name was Evelyn, and she had a voice like someone who had spent years being apologetic about taking up space, and was in the process of reconsidering that. I kept thinking I was overreacting, she told me in our first conversation. Kept thinking, he's family. Maybe I'm misremembering. Maybe I signed something I forgot I signed. I know that feeling, I said. How do you stop, she said. How do you stop second-guessing yourself? I thought about it, honestly, because she deserved an honest answer, and not a reassuring one. You find the evidence, I said. You stop trying to reconcile what you feel with what someone else is telling you, and you look at what is actually there. The evidence doesn't gaslight you. The documents either say what they say or they don't. I paused. And you find people who take what you're telling them seriously. That helps more than anything else. Having even one person who looks at the situation clearly and says, yes, you are right. This happened. We are going to do something about it. She was quiet for a moment. Thank you, she said. That's what we're here for, I said. Evelyn's case resolved in her favor 4 months after we took it. The nephew entered a guilty plea. The court ordered restitution. Not all of the money was recovered. It rarely is, but enough was recovered that her financial situation was stabilized, and her autonomy was legally restored, and her name was on her own accounts again. She sent the foundation a handwritten note. Adeze put it on the wall of the office in a frame. I read it every time I came in. On a Thursday in October 1 year, almost exactly. From the Tuesday the moving truck had pulled up outside my house. I stood inside the foundation's office in a building that looked, deliberately, like a place ordinary people could walk into without feeling like they needed an appointment. Adeze was at her desk with 3 files open. The attorney we had contracted, a young man named Saul, was on the phone in the conference room, his voice low and steady. There were 2 more cases in active progress, 3 in intake review, and Renee had told me the week before that a grant from a private foundation had come through that would allow us to expand staff by the end of the year. I had brought the clock. Not permanently, I had it in my car, and I brought it in to show Adeze, because she had asked about it once, early in our working relationship, when I had mentioned Gerald's name, and she had asked what he was like. It sat on Adeze's desk for the afternoon, while we worked. I kept glancing at it. The sound of it in the room felt right in a way I hadn't expected, not loud, just present, the way a heartbeat is present, steady underneath everything else. At the end of the day, when the office was emptying, and the October light was doing what October light does, going amber and long and a little elegiac, I sat at the table in the conference room alone for a while. I thought about the year, not in a structured way, not the way you review a document for completeness, just the way you think about a year when you're sitting inside what it produced. The Tuesday morning, with the coffee and the robe and the moving truck. The flip phone with 43% battery. Renee's voice on the other end saying, "Oh, they have no idea." Kitchen table with the documents spread across it, and Diane's pen clicking and Lila Marsh standing along the wall with her particular quality of still authority. The moment Celeste walked in and stopped. The moment I told Ethan the number and watched his face. The conversation where he cried without making a sound. The verdict, the sentence, the sale of the house. The rose bushes settling into new soil. Gerald's photograph on the counter of a new kitchen. Clock in a new room, ticking the way it always ticked, indifferent to geography. This office. Evelyn's handwritten note on the wall. Adeze's 3 open files. I had spent a year thinking about what had been taken from me. I had needed to think about it. You have to look at the wound clearly before you can decide what to do about it. But sitting in the conference room in the October light, I found that what I was thinking about was not what had been taken. What I was thinking about was what I had chosen. I had chosen to get off the kitchen floor metaphorically, because I had not literally been on the floor, but you understand what I mean. I had chosen Renee and Diane and the evidence and the truth and the discomfort of telling Ethan things he needed to hear, even when it would have been easier to simply mourn him and close the door. I had chosen to stay in the house until I chose to leave it. I had chosen to transplant the roses. I had chosen this office and this work, and Adeze and Evelyn's note on the wall. Every one of those choices was mine. They had tried to take my choices away from me. That was the thing at the center of everything they had done. The thing that connected the forged documents, and the fraudulent guardianship, and the insurance policy, and the moving crew. They had looked at a 69-year-old woman living alone and decided that her choices were up for grabs, that she had forfeited the right to determine what happened to her life. They had been wrong. Not because I was exceptional, I need to say that clearly. Because I am not exceptional, I am a person with particular advantages and a particular temperament and a particular set of carefully made decisions that happen to prepare me for something I never wanted to be prepared for. I am not exceptional, but I was not willing to disappear. And that unwillingness, the simple, stubborn, unglamorous refusal to disappear had been enough. I thought about all the women and men who did not have what I had, who faced the same schemes and the same documents and the same moving crews and did not have a flip phone in a dresser drawer or a trust attorney on speed dial or 40 years of careful preparation sitting underneath an ordinary-looking life, who disappeared because nobody was there when they needed someone to be there, who lost their homes and their autonomy, and sometimes more than that, quietly, without a verdict or a foundation or a year that turned into something they could recognize as theirs. That was why the work mattered. Not because I was trying to rewrite what had happened to me. You cannot rewrite what happened. You can only decide what it becomes, whether it becomes a thing that was done to you and ended there, or whether it becomes something you carry forward into work that matters. I had decided I want to say something to you directly, now, before this story ends. You may have listened to all of this and thought, that's a lot. And it is a lot. It is more than any person should have to navigate from their own kitchen in 72 hours. It is more than anyone should have to fight for the right to their own home, their own mind, their own choices, the right to be treated as a full human being rather than an asset to be liquidated. And yet, so many people do have to fight for it. So many people are fighting for it right now, today, in ordinary houses on ordinary streets, against family members who have convinced themselves that love and exploitation can coexist, that taking from someone who trusts you is somehow different from taking when done by the right people, for the right reasons. It is not different. Love is not a debt that can be collected. Love is not a transaction in which loyalty can be repaid by forking over your home. Love is not the reason that the people who raised you, who fed you, who stayed up through your fevers and packed your lunches and gave you every ordinary, unglamorous thing they had love, is not the reason those people should hand over their dignity when they are old and alone. And people who want what they have decided in the way. I am telling you this because I had to learn it late. I had to have a moving truck outside my house to understand, fully, that my value to my son's wife was entirely instrumental, that I existed in her calculation as a means to an end. And I had to understand, in the hard weeks that followed, that my son had looked at that calculation and made a choice not because he was a monster, but because he was weak in the specific way that people who need someone else to tell them who they are become weak when the wrong person does the telling. Weakness is not a defense. That is the thing I had to accept. He was weak, and his weakness had a cost, and the cost landed on me. Those two things can both be true. He can be worthy of eventual compassion, and also the full author of his choices. He can be my son, will always in some essential way be my son, and also the person who said yes on the phone. I hold both of those things. I hold them imperfectly, with bad days and unclear days and days when the yes on the phone is louder than anything else. That is the human version of moving forward, not the clean version, the real one. What I know now, at 69 years old, standing inside the work I built out of the wreckage of the worst month of my life, is this: your life is yours. Not because you can prevent everyone who wants to take it from trying. They will try. People who want what you have will construct elaborate justifications for why they should have it, and you should step aside. They will use love as a crowbar. They will use family as a reason. They will use your age or your grief or your isolation or your trust as a tool to pry open the door of everything you built. And you have the right, the full, complete, non-negotiable right to close that door. You have the right to look at the people in your life clearly, even the ones you love, even the ones you raised, and to see them as they are rather than as you hoped they would be. You have the right to protect yourself from people who would use your love against you. You have the right to set boundaries that are real and that hold, even when the person on the other side of the boundary is someone you would have given anything for on a different day. Loving someone and protecting yourself from them are not opposites. They can live in the same heart at the same time. That is not a contradiction. That is just the truth about what love looks like when it has to exist alongside damage. I am not telling you to be hard. Hard is not what I am. Cried in my bathroom twice during the worst of the legal process, alone where nobody could see me. I sat on the floor of my new kitchen the first night after the move and felt the particular grief of no longer being in the house where my husband had died, where my son had grown up, where I had spent the middle of my life. I am not hard. I am just honest. And I am telling you to be honest too, about who is really in your life, about what they are really asking for, about what you are giving and what is being taken, and whether those two things have started to look the same. The clock on a Daisy's desk ticked into the silence of the October afternoon. I had brought it to show her what it looked like. I had not realized until I was sitting here with it that bringing it here was also bringing it home. That evening I drove back to my new house, the one 40 minutes north with the managed garden and the good light, and Gerald's 7 roses settled in the side yard, beginning, after a summer of establishing themselves in new soil, to look like they had always been there. I made dinner, something simple, something I actually wanted. I placed Gerald's photograph on the kitchen counter, where it always was now, and I set the clock on the shelf above the window, where I could hear it from the table. I sat down. The ticking was steady and ordinary, and entirely indifferent to everything that had happened in the year behind it, which was exactly what ticking should be. Time does not comfort or mourn, it just continues. The meaning of it, what you make of the time you have, what you build in it, what you refuse to surrender, and what you choose to carry, and what you finally, carefully, with full knowledge of what it costs, set down, that part is yours. All of it is yours. It always was.